So Angela's overview has highlighted how relentless the last couple of years have been, and that has the social and economic impacts associated with each have been, huge, and of course disadvantaged populations have borne the brunt. And your sector, as you know, have been at the front line of that. The numbers are scary enough, but to bring the more up close and personal perspective, we're now joined by some of the peak bodies who commissioned the research, and thank you for commissioning that research because, as I said, that's what the governments need to hear. So we're going to welcome Kate Munro, who's the CEO of Youth Action, John Engeler, the CEO of Shelter New South Wales, Giancarlo de Vera, the Senior Manager of Policy People with Disabilities Australia, Kim Stace, Sector Engagement Manager of FAMS, Yasmut, the Executive Officer, Local Community Service Association, and Michelle Rogers, Program Manager, Ngunya Jarjum, to the stage, please. Kate, we are going to start with you again. It doesn't take much to know young people had a rough time during the pandemic, as did their parents who had to stay home looking after them. I had 3. Your fitness goes up. There's no greater incentive to run than 3 children at home. They had to do schooling or study from home. Many lost their jobs. Many had to move back home with mum and dad, and their ability to socialise and hang out with their friends was, severely restricted. Particularly during teenage years, and that's when you're learning so much about yourself and who your tribe is. So the impact of that, I'm sure we will feel long into the distance. Do the aftershock reports tell us anything we didn't know, and what should our sector be doing differently or more to support young people?
So thank you. And I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people here. So I'm Kate, I'm the CEO of Youth Action, and we're the peak body that represents young people 12 to 24 years in New South Wales. I also want to acknowledge this is the first live event I think we've done in 3 years, so it's intense. There's a whole lot of people here. And I've got some notes on my phone, so it's not like I've forgotten that we're live and I'm doing a bit of multitasking, but I actually have some notes on my phone, so bear with me. So what did we... No, we didn't learn anything new at all. But what I do want to say is that what was really clear in the aftershock reports, and is really clear to anyone who's working with young people, is that young people, and anyone who has young people, we all have young people in our lives in different ways, but young people were impacted in every area of their life. And all young people. So we're not talking about a group on the side. All young people were impacted, and across many dimensions of their lives. And that includes, mental health and learning and work and family lives and where they live and what happens in their communities. And so these statistics should shock us, and they should shock us out of that complacency. I don't say this to disempower young people, and I don't say this to stay in a deficit-focused space. We're very aware about not speaking about young people as objects of policy, but rather as active agents. But this should shock us. The effects of this will be long-lasting. We know with young people, children and young people as well, that the default position is often not to reveal things straight away. So this stuff is going to play out for a really, really long time, and we need to keep that in the front of our minds, because this is really important. And one of the really key reasons I say this is I want to make young people really visible in policy making, and they're a bit invisible. They're kind of absorbed in policies that are happening for other population groups within society. And I want young people to be front and centre, because they really are, they will be bearing the effects of this. As Dee said, she stole a little bit of my speech, which is about this stuff happened at such a critical time in young people's development. This happens at a time when young people, some are transitioning into high school, they're forming their identity. Some are leaving home, they're trying to figure out career, can I get a job, can I get a career, do I keep learning, what are these things, what does my life look like? And the upheaval of the past few years, and it's not just the pandemic, it's the bushfire, it's the drought, it's the floods, it's just this constant sense of anxiety for young people. That stuff, the futures that we all took for granted, young people don't take that for granted anymore. And again, I I don't want to sit in a dark space, but I think it's really important to reflect on what does that feel like. So that's all young people. And then we know that groups of young people from those groups that are very often socially excluded, so First Nations young people from culturally diverse communities, regional young people, LGBTQIA plus young people with disability, and young people doing it tough. Life was hard for them before all of this happened. And then you layer this on top, and that group are, they are just overwhelmed by this. It's really difficult. And many have disappeared and disengaged and, are just trying to figure this out on their own. So I think that, for me, what works and what we know, what young people tell us, I guess, a couple of things. So young people tell us that they're deeply worried about things for their peers, for their families, for their communities. Young people this generation of young people are incredibly compassionate. They worry about everyone, and they're worried about it for everyone, including themselves. I think that what we know works, and I'm not telling anyone anything different, what we know works is targeted investment in services that support young people, that are specialised. There are policies and strategies that support young people and identify them and don't lump them into this cohort of, well, we might catch them because they're over 18, or we might catch them because they're children and they're under 18. Youth work and working with young people, and for those who do that in this room, we know that it's a specialised skill and it really needs to be recognised and it needs to be invested in. And so I think that in terms of the answer to all of this is creating safe spaces. We know that youth services and well-directed policies that create opportunities for young people, that creates safe spaces where young people have an opportunity to be connected to trusted adults. They have an opportunity to engage with others. Young people tell us all the time that the most important things to them to help them thrive are having meaning and purpose in their lives, having a connection to family, friends, community, culture, and having a voice. And this is what good youth services and good opportunities that are created by good youth policy do for young people. And this is what will help them heal and recover and, and thrive and reach their potential. So I think it's about that investment in those places that do that really deep relational work with young people. It's not as easy as young people, and again, you all know this, young people don't walk into a service or come up to an adult or a parent or a family member and go, oh, there's this thing and I figured it all out and here's what I need and I need A, B and C. They never do that. Half the time they're not even sure what they need, and we need to create safe spaces and places where they can figure out the answers to these things and they can have these opportunities to be held. We know wait lists are long for mental health services. We know that there's a lot of, lots of things are complex and are going to take a long time to fix. And so that's where this place-based, and I know that Jan and others will talk so much about place-based, having the opportunity of these local place-based spaces for young people in their own communities where they go and figure out what's next is the first and most important step in our mind anyway about what's going to help, help young people through this. And I think we all have that responsibility to, like I said, this has affected every young person that we know, both professionally and personally. I think that's probably me.
I noticed a lot of the unis gave early entry to HSC students this year, which I thought was great. And sure enough, the Daily Telly writes a story the other day. It's outrageous. It's taking the pressure off them. Have they not had enough pressure the last couple of years? I thought that take on, on kids actually just sort of being able to relax a little bit towards the end of what has been the most incredibly stressful couple of years was actually a good thing. But apparently, according to the Daily Telly, it's not. They need more stress. Now, John, changing pace here, we're going to go to the housing market. We know what Sydney housing is like at the best of times. Has the pandemic and multiple natural disasters changed it? What's the difference between the trends and cycles that we normally see, and what different responses does this necessitate? Are our young people ever going to be able to afford to buy a house? I added that last bit in.
Dee and I share a part of the world which is where my children at the moment definitely won't be able to afford to live where we currently live. So John's my name, from Shelton, New South Wales. We represent the whole housing system, so it's great to be able to look at homelessness all the way through to, and increasingly, we wouldn't have thought this was necessarily even a topic for us, people who are about to face huge problems with rising interest rates and housing insecurity, despite the fact that they might own that house. They might in fact end up renting it from the bank for 40 years if they're lucky. So we'd like to acknowledge, of course, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. We at Shelter in particular, and the whole Shelter network, always says, if we're talking about housing, land, the stuff that houses are built on, we must acknowledge that this land was never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal. I pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. If you like to think about the New South Wales housing system, just very quickly to give you a visual, it's a bit like the Titanic. It's a bit like the Titanic in that we sort of know what is happening, but imagine as if there's three classes of people. So there's already the people who are, you know, in first class, if you like. They're the people who currently own properties, unencumbered, don't have a mortgage. And we do like to break housing into three simple areas. We probably need not to anymore. We have people who own outright, people who are owning a mortgage, they're paying it off, and then people who are renting. They're the three traditional areas. We add other areas like homelessness and you know, special bits and pieces, but they're often boutique. Three big areas: you either own, you rent, or you're paying off a mortgage. It's like the Titanic, through this whole pandemic, being the metaphor for the New South Wales housing system, has said, if you already own a property, actually, don't worry about those lifeboats. You can order a water taxi. You know, you're fine. You're going to be doing okay. You did very well out of the pandemic. The people who are in that second category, so people paying off a mortgage, I think some of them are going to be worse off. They've taken on bigger debts than they should have. They're going to have difficulty servicing. Retiring is the ironic word that we use, economists like Angela would use, to retire that level of debt over a working lifetime where incomes aren't rising. Interest rates are rising. It's unlikely that many of those people will be able to own a substantial equitable share in that property. They'll have a big balloon payment at the end. Good luck trying to secure some alternate accommodation. So they've almost moved from what was second class down into steerage. And the people who were renters, who were probably in that sort of, we often talk about renters in New South Wales being treated as second class citizens, they've effectively been moved to steerage. They've been told that's it, you're going to the bottom of the pile. So I think the main thing that we'd say, what has New South Wales been typified by during the pandemic? People who were doing very well did very well and stayed well, fine, protected, in fact did much better with their capital growth. People who were paying off a mortgage have actually probably gone down. They're going to be faced with a difficult situation. But renters in particular were unequivocally shown to be second-class citizens. And sometimes the data, and we struggled with this, I know, when we spoke a few times, because of the time lag or the series, and as Angela was talking, it reminded me, we often experience life forward but understand it backwards. We'll see this lag come up in some other time. So we've got a whole group of people renting, likely to rent for much longer. So three things. We now can see there are people who are new. So the aftershocks, three new areas. Renters who will rent for a lot longer, possibly all of their life when they thought they might not, and will be lucky if they get any security with that rental. So what we desperately need to see as a policy lever is changing to stop renting being a second class. We need tenure protection. Another big area, and I just want to touch on this, is affordable housing as a particular concept or subset of renters, if you like. So the COVID taught us, and it's a bit of a shame that we've not kept this, but when we talk about essential workers, we sometimes don't know what we mean. We say key workers, essential workers. A really good definition that we use in our organisation is, if you can't ring up and say, I've decided to work from home today, then you're probably an essential worker. Let's be clear. We're not talking about people who've got choice. Often working out of hours, often travelling huge distances to get to work for lower paid or barely minimum wage employment. These are the cleaners, the checkout operators, and the carers, aged care, childcare, disability. They kept us fed, safe and watered during COVID. So if we didn't for a period recognise the value of an essential worker, that ship might have sailed. The reason why I bring that up is because that was an area where these were people who once upon a time would not have described themselves as being in precarious or difficult housing. All of a sudden, and I think that's what we need to move towards, is always housing security. Affordability can be measured very easily objectively. But I think the great thing about these reports, we link those chapters. So we know, and we looked at, the correlation between, say, mental health or youth or DV correlates perfectly with housing security, not just housing affordability. And you could miss the argument if you looked at just, well, what's housing affordability doing? There was a bit of a period there where they were giving away units in Melbourne CBD and Sydney CBD. That was a very brief period, a very small outlier statistically. So let's not think that, and let's not be convinced by Real Estate Institute and all sorts of other people saying it was fine, it was fantastic, the market solved. It didn't. It was made very difficult for people, measured in subjectively security, not just affordability. Finally, one area that we've known, and we've touched on it a few times, areas of New South Wales that were once seen as being really easy to get secure accommodation in became very difficult. And I point to a couple in particular, and we've done some work on this, and we've got, in addition to the work that we've done with Engeler and others, Dr. Kim Horton did a piece of research for us from the Regional Australia Institute. Towns like Cessnock, once upon a time, always affordable, pretty easy to get, low vacancies, you know, easy. Very difficult now. One of the bigger areas now of housing. So as it moves across, as we've seen the pandemic, whether it's from, you know, fires in Bega or floods in Lismore or the pandemic itself, the regional push has created huge problems. We've now seen areas of a new market of housing insecurity, renters in regions. I'll quickly just say, sometimes we are good at describing how bad the situation is, but I'm heartened by some recent examples about what the solutions might be. So for those of you who saw that Four Corners program, I think 2 weeks ago now, fantastic illumination of what's going on in Coffs Harbour in particular. So I just use Coffs Harbour as an example. I've got Yvonne here from Coffs Harbour in the room and a few other people I know. That program demonstrated that, I think, if we're sitting back and waiting for just one arm of government, the state government, to solve it by building more social housing, I think we could be waiting a long time. As we've identified that we need affordable housing, so I'll just recap again, affordable housing is for key workers. It's capital A, affordable housing. It's a particular programmatic response, and it's typically identified as being 75% of the market rent. That's the idea. There's a great opportunity, as I'm standing in, having gone to Coffs Harbour last week with the kids on holidays, dragging them around to the Argyle estate, which is a big public housing area that we'd like to see be improved as part of the 5,000 social housing, or 5%, which Angela's right, better to peg it as a basic metric. There's lots that local councils can do, not on their own, but if we think that the market fails and government has a responsibility to step in, then when you get all three levels of government operating together, magical things can happen. So we'd be suggesting as part of this, well, what to do from here. Local councils working with land that they may have, not to give it away, but to lease it. Lease it cleverly to community housing organisations, well supported by the state. The local government might provide the land, and the federal government might be able to provide the building grant funding or low-cost loan to pay it back. There's things that councils can do. And I'll finish on this one. It is important that when Albo started talking about having grown up in, he started the narrative by saying, I grew up in council housing. He shifted it to saying, I grew up in public housing. He's now gone back to, and I'm sure it's not coincidental, it's quite deliberate, I grew up in council housing. Councils do have a role. It was the council of South Sydney at the time, or the equivalent, before it was amalgamated. But councils do have a responsibility. Not just the opportunity, but I think a responsibility. So, coming out of all of this, whilst it might be dire in terms of the numbers and the metrics and what bad things there is, there's also some great light, some opportunities where councils, working together with their local communities, could provide much needed affordable housing for key workers. It absolutely is a bit of a no-brainer. They need the carers, the cleaners, the hospitality workers, the students. There's a whole lot of people who work naturally in that area. So if COVID's shown us some things that we need to be disappointed about, it's also provided us equally some great opportunities where we can jump in. So that would be what we'd like to see on the basis of this sort of report and others. What can happen at a local level, regional areas, council stepping in with other levels of government to really step in and answer. Finally, when we talk about social and affordable housing, we don't like to pick that bubble too often, but there's not that much affordable housing. In New South Wales, there's about 150,000 units or dwellings of what we would call public housing or social housing. 2/3 of it's still controlled by the government, 1/3 of it through community housing organisations. So on a good day, not quite, but about 5%. Let's just say it's 5%. Less than 5% of that 5%, I'll say that again, less than 5% of that 5%, in fact, well less than 5%, is what we would call affordable housing for key workers. So as much as we all talk about it, and there's a lot of romanticising, saying, isn't this a great idea? There's very little of it. And unfortunately, some of it is tied with the federal government scheme, which is about to end, the National Rental Affordability Scheme. So just as a note of caution, we talk about social and affordable housing. We use the terms almost interchangeably. They're very different things. There ain't that much affordable housing. So if there's one thing that we could push for and really make a huge policy difference in, I think it's the formalisation of affordable housing as a key policy here in New South Wales. Thank you.
That's good. And I think maybe also some caveats on developers when they're, well, I mean, we build communities badly. Sure. We build 400 four-bedroom houses, and if you want to downsize, you either have to leave your community, so people don't want to, so they stay in their four-bedroom house, so the prices go up, and it's just madness. And we need to do something about
True.
Yep. And negative gearing at some point when a government's game enough to go there. So, Giancarlo, we talk about housing, and housing is bad for everyone. But when it comes to people with disability, you ramp it up, obviously, by, I don't know what the number would be, but it's almost impossible now for people with disability to get a house, and for anyone who's lost it due to floods or fires and whatever they're in, in an awful state. Can you talk us through that? How, what can be done? What is being done? Is there, is there policies that are going to make a difference?
Yeah, look, firstly, I just want to acknowledge the land I'm on, the Gadigal people they live and work on as well, and particularly I'd like to pay my respects to First Peoples with disability who are disproportionately living with disability themselves. Firstly, yes, it's, I guess, to paint a picture really, not to be a Debbie Downer, but people with disability are poor, one and two of us have a job. We have the second highest relative risk of poverty in the OECD. We're bloody Australia. Can you believe how poor and how disproportionately economically disempowered people with disability are? And I think that's really, so when you talk about affordability, I'm like, but where's the big A? The other A, that's accessibility. And what are the really key policy issues that kind of comes down to people in our camp? I'm looking at, some people in this room who are working with me right now on this very issue, is how do you make everywhere accessible? Not just housing, but everywhere, everything, every system, because social housing is great, but at the moment we have a government and some other and who are committed to working to a limited degree of accessibility. So we call them silver level accessible guidelines, which is two down from the top. Right, so we could really be doing a lot better, obviously, when it comes to accessible. And so I want to have a place that I want to have a future in mind where we have people who can live anywhere and they know they can live there. And it's not just for people with disabilities. It's I'm looking at my colleague across the room. She knows exactly who she is. People can age in place as well. And so it's really just a huge conversation that needs to start happening. And part of the question is obviously those who can't afford to live. So we do have people who are living in social housing as well. So absolutely, yes, we've got to peg it to a percentage, but we've got to make sure that those those places are actually accessible as well. The other thing that I think that COVID taught us is that our supports don't move with us easily. When we're in a situation of risk. If you lose your wheelchair in the flood in Lismore, fat chance getting a wheelchair really quickly. So how do you then deal with both informal and formal supports that travel with you? So we've got to make sure that we have places that we can go to, systems that we can access that are really there to support us in every single way. And the COVID really highlights some really key obvious places. The housing system is one of them, but DVF is another. We heard Engeler from with the DVF statistics. DVF really impacted our community, and it's probably going to stay. A lot of us are still locked in. We only had National Cabinet lock the. I dropped the isolation conditions, and that scares us. A lot of people will be staying in their homes. I can guarantee it, because they know they're vulnerable. But it also means that we've got to make sure that we, in the systems that we actually already in, that we actually can be safe with the knowledge that we can actually stay there. So if you're thinking of social housing tenant, for instance, the solution isn't to take me to the western suburbs. The solution is to say, right, how can we modify this place so I can stay in this place? Because I've been here for 20 years, my community's here, my informal supports are here, so as well as my formal support. So how can I make sure that I stay here? But obviously we have a government who's we're not too far from social housing that just got moved across the city. And so we really need to consider how that actually works. But in terms of the solutions, we need to, if I can leave you with three things, we've got to be prepared in every single way. So when it comes to what we call situations of risks, that everybody has the chance to be prepared in every stage of every stage, whether it be preparing 5 years immediately after or during a situation of risk. The second thing is, as John was saying, is that we've got to work locally. We keep talking about local solutions, and it was so embarrassing. Like we were talking to some of our colleagues in the Pacific, and they knew exactly where the disabled folks were. Like I was working with the federal government, and like they couldn't tell me where disabled people were. And so, like, what role does local government have? What roles do local community stakeholders have in identifying people who are vulnerable? To ensure that they get the supports they need, because as I said, supports don't travel when you're displaced. And so one of the things that we did, particularly the second flood in Lismore earlier this year, is like we worked with local councils to say, right, you have a vulnerable persons list. Let's try and work with you to try and identify them and make sure that you've reached out proactively to make sure that those people that are on that list are supported. And so there's so many solutions that we can have that we can create if we can just think about something. Think about that from the very beginning. And lastly, it's the decisions have to be driven by us. I think we hear it all the time. It doesn't matter what community you're from. If it affects them, then we've got to be part of it. And one of the things that we need to see a lot more of is us being part of the production of those solutions, because we get consulted to death. We're 1 in 5 people, in this country, and so it just makes it very difficult. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that you can that you can have conversations with us, but make sure that we do it at our own pace. Like, we can't be forced to make decisions, and that's why I said earlier, prepared is key. And so if we work together in good time, we can make solutions happen and make solutions that work for us.
Thank you. Good luck with the local councils thing, though. Yeah. Our local council approved social housing in our street, and one of the rooms is being rented by an accountancy firm.
Oh, wow.
Oh. Kim, families doing homeschooling did it tough enough, but for a lot of families who were already under pressure, where, parents were accessing support already, how was that dealt with during COVID? Did Zoom work? What did you learn from it? And are there any sort of takeouts from that to doing it better in the future?
Thanks, Dee. I think without a doubt, the sector shifted very quickly and very adequately to deal with a different situation. And I must say, I was actually very fortunate. We have grown adult children. I was not put in the position where I actually needed to do any home learning with children. So I do take my hat off to all of you parents and carers who have actually done that. In fact, we had a house that was built for 6 people, and all of our children have moved out. So when COVID hit, we actually had space, almost half a house each, in which to spread out. And during that time, I think, we were inspired by the sector. Children had gone back into the homes. There were children and young people who were really just not being seen. So it was very important for services to try and have some sort of sight on children. We all know that first and foremost, children are impacted by their environment. So whatever was happening in the household was happening to them first. So that was the first layer. And then on top of that, we had any issues that were happening to themselves. And for children where we'd already identified issues, they were sort of being looked at a little bit more closely. But there were new issues created for families and also for the children and young people in families. So it was problematic for parents, and of course they were dealing with their own issues, and the time and energy into putting into identifying things in children was just really hard for families. So services picked up on that. It was like they intuitively knew. So they would be doing things like dropping around parcels. They'd be picking up learning packs from schools and dropping them off to families. There were conversations happening over verandas, up 3 stories of workers actually talking to children and families just to touch base, just to see that everyone was okay, to see them, to have conversations, to hear their voices.
Was it tricky not being able to be inside the house? Because I would imagine in those situations, visual cues of what's going on are just not there in a Zoom.
Absolutely. And, you know, the only access they really had to inside the homes was that in a computer, on a video. You know, workers were really great at thinking of ingenious ways to get children, to show them the work. They would drop off parcels and things and activities for children to do. So the workers would be saying, oh, how did the kids go with this activity this week? And the children were showing. And it was really an innovative way of working with families and a new way of working with families. We had workers who would dress up and get online to do their transition to school programs, because of course that was another learning that children not for really missed out on, that transition to school, that face-to-face, that importance of learning to sit and eat, you know, recess or lunch all in one go, to be able to pack up your lunchbox, then put it away in your bag, learning to sit and wait to go to the bathroom. My husband and I went to see Peter and the Wolf, and for all of you that grew up with Peter and the Wolf as a symphony, it was just a spectacular thing. But the amount of children and fathers and parents who, during a 3/4 of an hour set, were getting up to go to the bathroom and things like that, things that children sort of learn in those transition to school. And those play groups and all of those other areas. So we have children going to school now that we're just not sure where their developmental stage is. And it will be an interesting AEDC this year to see the results of this year and even next year and the years that follow, to see where children are at this point in time. I think as far as the future goes for our children, you are all the services collecting the needs. You actually will know what children are needing going forward. And I think when we talk about voice, our voices do need to be louder. You were there at the coalface, and I know Jean will talk about this, but people went to their local community centre because that's where they knew they could get help. And they were guaranteed of it. No closed doors, people were helping, people getting things to others where they could. So it was that, yeah, that is the beginning of the power that we now have. And we need to keep and maintain it so that we are a bigger voice. Please, come to us, come to all of your peaks. I think we're able to sort of gather those voices into messages to get through, but please do not stop saying what you feel your community, who you work in and for, need.
Thank you very much. So you mentioned community organisations, so we'll come to Jean now. Now, community organisations were the heart and soul during COVID. It's where people went for food, shelter, financial advice and all other things. But we know people who work those community centres are exhausted. We also know that volunteers have been such a part of them, but as costs grow in Sydney, as people are working longer hours, needing more paid work, the amount of volunteers you're going to get are less. What is the future for community organisations? How can they sort of get through this time into the future? How does it look?
Well, firstly, I want to pick up on the notion of voice and community that I think has come through, not only those two that actually referred that I will be speaking about it, but I think it has come through the entire panel and also what Angela said at the beginning. Ultimately, you know, we acknowledge country. I pay my respect as well, obviously, to First Nations for the custodianships, but I really do believe that the voice of First Nations will guide us into the future. I think that we have a responsibility, a civic responsibility, to support the the Uluru Statement from the Heart and where the constitutional change is going to take us. Rather than just talking about the constitutional change process, I think what we don't talk about is what does that actually mean? What will that actually do for the country? So I am personally a little bit frustrated that we talk about, or comparing always about how things were before the pandemic as to how they are now. I really think we need to be bold and we need to be courageous and think about change. There are things that have to change. Everything that we've heard is, these are not new issues, they just have been exacerbated. And if anything, ANCOS leading this report and the work that you've done, Angela, if there's anything that we can see here is that there is an economic cost to it, but there's especially one if we don't do anything differently. When it comes to, I'm not dodging your question, I just thought that, you know, this is the context in which community-based, place-based organizations, Aboriginal control organizations play a very important role when it comes to civic courage and democracy, you know, grassroots democracy to actually make a difference. So I firstly also, or secondly, I'm now at the second point of saying that our member organizations, neighborhood centers and community centers in New South Wales, during the pandemic, but also during the natural disasters that have been unprecedented recently, in the recent years, have played an essential role in community in responding to a crisis or to a series of crises. You know, if you think about Mullumbimby Neighbourhood Centre during the floods, or the Parks Network in Wetherill Park during the Fairfield lockdowns, or, you know, Tyrene is here, and there's others here that know exactly how taxing it has been for organizations to actually be there, have an open door policy, be the soft entry point for a lot of people that had never had to access the service system ever before. The pressures on our system are, you know, big and bad at best of times. And when you have something like a natural disaster or a pandemic or, you know, God forbid, a war, then people do come to places where they need to find somehow information as to how to navigate a system that they never had to access before. And it's often in those situations that neighborhood centers and community centers are the place to go and can provide you with that information. But during times of crisis, obviously, our members also step up to the mark of doing the emergency relief and immediate relief that is required. The challenge that sits behind that, I guess, is that when you combine this crisis relief, emergency relief work with what I said before, that we have a civic democratic role to play in society by capturing voice, by empowering people to, you know, to support efforts of self-determination and support marginalized groups, they often are not going hand in hand. It's quite challenging to be a service delivery agent on one hand and to be, you know, an activist organization on the other. You know, let's call it community development and benevolence, right? So on one hand, benevolence is important and we need to do that emergency relief work and provide that welfare. But on the other hand, we don't want to treat people just because of their deficits to a certain degree. We want to work with their strengths and abilities and so on and do the community development work that needs to be done. And that's a constant dance and challenge. And what I've got two more points to make. So the next point where this leads me to is that one positive thing that has come out from the pandemic in particular is that we have made the distinction along these two lines, also as service delivery and social infrastructure. This soft entry point, community centers, place-based organizations are essential for the community infrastructure that are required to build a better society. And that has been for the first time recognized by politicians in particular and public service. There were small examples, but important examples. I mean, we've seen it during the floods, obviously. You know, where's the neighborhood center? There is this whole narrative around place-based organisations now, they are the ones that should be there when it comes to natural disasters. But during the pandemic, what we've seen is that, let's roll out free rats for, everybody who is now on the pension can't get it from the federal government anymore and so on. Well, we got the phone call a day before from DCJ, and they said, we need social infrastructure. Can we roll it out through neighbourhood centres? And I said, yes, please. That's exactly what social infrastructure is and what it can do. We can get to communities very quickly, very efficiently. But is there any funding for that? No. Is there any recognition of that any further than, but look, it's one step at a time. But the fact that social policy started to recognize social infrastructure and importance is really important. And NCOS has picked it up on the election campaign as well. It's our election platform that obviously will be represented through other peaks, and NCOS in particular, with a call for investment into social infrastructure as infrastructure. And that's external language. Internally, we say that would be a really good community development investment, right? Asking for community development from government is generally quite a challenge because it doesn't show the outcomes. I want to make one more, or it's hard to show in economic terms what the outcomes are. I want to make one last point, and this is, look, it's not scientifically kind of researched by me, but it is something that I've been quite passionate about, and that is comparing the community services system with the health system. So just bear with me and come along with me here for a second, because it's not a clear science, like I said. But if you think about how during the pandemic decisions were made based on the capacity of the health system. So how many hospital beds do we have? How many ICU beds do we have? How many vaccines do we have? Like there has been constant questions around the capacity of the health system that determine whether we will be locked down or not, that determine whether we will have restrictions, powers or public health orders made upon us or not. So economic and political decision-making was based on health system capacity. On the other hand, when you look about our sector, that capacity question has never come up. Like, doesn't matter what happens with the economy and political and health, the community services system will be okay. Like, we'll just dump another 2 million people into the community services system. No question asked about our staff burnout, our capacity to deliver, and we are underfunded at best of times.
Yep.
So, and dare I say, the health system is actually funded quite well in Australia at times of no pandemic. Like, generally speaking, we have a system that actually copes, whereas I don't think that our sector copes at best of times, and it just drives me personally quite nuts to think about how political decision making can be so blind. It's really a blind spot and ignorance to think that our sector will just always oblige when there is a crisis, and then the question of volunteering comes up. Let's not even go there, but
Yep. Look, there's no question governments are now taking grassroots organisations a lot more seriously since those grassroots organisations started taking their seats.
Yeah.
Which goes back to Kathy McGowan's point. So, Michelle, we're going to move on to you finally. There is no doubt that every single issue we have talked about disproportionately affects First Nations and Indigenous people. And we continue to apply our white person, we know better, here's our one-size-fits-all policy, which doesn't work. What can we do to address things in a more culturally appropriate way? Or what would it look like? Not what we can do, because we are not doing it right. What can be done to address it in a more culturally appropriate way? And what difference would it make?
Thank you. So I first choose to pause to acknowledge Uncle Alan's welcome. It would be culturally inept of me not to do that. I'm a Wiradjuri woman, Daby descent. I'm visiting on Bundjalung lands now for over half my life. Bundjalung lands in Lismore, northern New South Wales. I work at Ngunya Jarjum Aboriginal Child and Family Service, and there do a lot of things, but I guess I want to point out probably our alignment, a strong affiliation with ABSEC as our peak organisation in this space. So I guess, wow, to go to that question, it's loaded with so many things. But Tracy, I guess I want to first of all say thank you for acknowledging the rawness of the Aftershock series, because for Lismore in northern New South Wales, we of course have seen our share. Other people are certainly seeing their share, as we've even seen in the media this morning. The rawness of those stats are people. Those people are stats. And we live it, we experience, we breathe it, we walk it, we talk it day in, day out in Lismore still. Ngunya Jarjum, we're the largest employer of Aboriginal peoples on the far north coast of New South Wales. We have 95% of our staff cohort identify as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander descent, and over 65% of them are from the local communities. Something we're very, very proud of and we brag about regularly, as you could well imagine. It was our saving grace during floods, I've got to say, because the Koori grapevine is our saving grace. The Koori grapevine, nothing works as effectively as it. I mean, you can trust me, the mobile towers went down, the voices didn't, yeah? It's amazing what can happen over a backyard fence. We know our communities, we are our community, we breathe our community, we walk and talk within our community. We belong. So I guess when I'm thinking today about some of the things that have been talked about on the panel, and what a dynamic panel, hey? But I'm kind of thinking, about a few of the things around what, from a First Nations lens, really is unique or different to the experience of non-Aboriginal experience, and I won't use the word mainstream because I learned something from Paul today. And Kate talked about our youth, and I'm thinking, what is it we need to be offering our youth now that looks different, that opens opportunities? Kate talked particularly about youth being a place of developing identity and belonging. And I think to myself about cultural experience of healing for our youth. What opportunities are there moving ahead to enhance, bringing back cultural ways of practice, knowing, being and doing for our youth to be able to experience that, to support the recovery through mental health as a result of pandemics, floods, bushfires, bushfires, floods, pandemics. And I think we're up to water again, last I checked. So I think there was clouds in the sky as I was leaving home. So I guess that's one of the things I'd like probably for us as First Nations to be acknowledged for. I had the privilege working with a group of youth recently who wanted to identify for themselves what they saw to be the priority for them to focus their energy and their work in, and what they chose was arranging some workshops for youth to be able to understand cultural ways of healing. So the youth actually asked them, believe it or not, they did come back with a response that actually was really, really grounded. It's amazing what happens when you trust people to know what they want. So I also, homelessness. I just want to acknowledge, I think the Titanic, John, I love that. I love the Titanic analogy, but I'm just thinking to myself, we're not even at the same starting gate. Let's think about that in real terms. Where it comes to housing and Indigenous communities, our communities, we've never been at the same start line. So you talked about being at steerage. I'm thinking, no, where are we on the Titanic? Were we ever on the Titanic?
Didn't get a ticket.
Yeah, I'm wondering where the tickets were. So I guess that's kind of the housing issue where it comes to access, equity, all of those things, where the outright blatant racism that still exists within the private rental market in particular around access, especially in rural and remote communities where, your family name determines whether or not you even get a Guernsey. And the amount of energy that we put into trying to challenge the private rental market into exposing that racism, that outright racism. But Yeah, and I don't have to tell everyone about the availability and access to public and or community housing sectors, yeah. So, yeah, I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Kim, I always love to listen to you talk. But I guess my thoughts when you were talking was about acknowledging the Aboriginal community knowledge and wisdom of our all of family and community approach to parenting and keeping children safe. It may surprise some to know that we actually survived for 60,000 plus years before we were visited. And maybe, just maybe, we had some parenting skills, yeah, that might have helped us do some of that. So I guess what I want to say is parenting looks different. It's meant to be different because our culture looks different. Yeah, if we don't look different, then where is our culture? Would what be my question? So I guess, yes, I would expect Aboriginal families to operate differently. I would expect us to look different when there is assessments. I would expect different assessment tools for Aboriginal children and families in the child protection space. And I think Paul alluded to that space earlier. Jan, yeah, I'm in awe of neighbourhood centres. I'm in a little household secret. My mum actually was president of a neighbourhood centre for many years. I think that's where I got my community spirit from. But I guess, yes, that port of call, the importance, I guess where we went down in the floods in 22, for Ngunya Jarjum next year was our community gateway. And our community gateway went down with us. So it really difficult delivering all kinds of community service delivery from when one of our core partners next door to us actually lost their building at the same time. So I just want to talk about that. But again, the importance of ACCOs, Aboriginal community controlled organisations in that space is we actually know our communities. We know our vulnerable families. We are our community and we are part of our vulnerable families. So where it comes to mapping, Giancarlo, you mentioned around the council's register. Yeah, apparently Lismore City Council has one.
Vulnerable persons list, yeah.
A vulnerable persons list, okay. Yeah, because that makes me curious. Again, we just kind of know each other. And really profound, I know, to think that. But, yeah, we actually know who our vulnerable families are because we are part of our communities. Therefore, we don't need to keep the register. Instead, we need to keep in touch with one another. And we need to be trusted to know our business in our communities and be funded to deliver our business in our communities our way, which may look different because it's meant to. It's culturally led. So I guess that's kind of where I was, some of the thoughts that I had. You heard at the last panel, bless, she's so cute, 2 ears, 1 mouth. She then talked to us about 2 hands, and I was also raised with 2 feet, and that's about making your steps, stepping forward and not walking backwards. So I guess I wanted to share that today as well, is just my thoughts around trusting us to know our business, trusting us to know our communities, trusting us to deliver to our communities our way, which is meant to look different. Don't measure against outcomes, and the government will measure against outcomes that they see as their priorities. But oftentimes they're treating, very much treating the symptom and not the cause. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you very much for that, Michelle. And I think that lesson of sort of trust and trust in the community to know that they know what they're doing is sort of, we're hearing that sort of over and over again from people that, oddly enough, some bloke in an office in Canberra does not know better. Who would have thought? We're going to open up to questions, and then I'm going to get Angela just to do a very quick recap. I know we're going into lunchtime, but I know we do have a couple of questions there, so we will start. Have we got some? While we're waiting for that, I've just got one question here via one of our internet watchers.
weekend talking about how our growth suburbs on the edge of Sydney don't have enough social infrastructure built in from the beginning. A fantastic point for her to have made. She wants to know, how does the proposed school model work for students who are thoroughly disengaged? Can we look at a wraparound model but flexibility with neighbourhood hubs as part of that? And I think Olivia, our leader of our school gateway project, is the person to answer that question. So, Olivia, over to you.
I don't think I have the answer to that question, Joanna. That's really unfair.
That is what CEOs do.
Right. I'd like to say yes, that the school hub model could work very close. I mean, it should work very closely anyway with the community services that are in its community to engage young people, children and young people who have disengaged from the school. And I think that was the question. But the model is that it is wrapping the services, integrating the services around the children where they are, and the young people and their families. And so the answer has to be yes. Work with whoever has the relationship, wherever is the safe place. And for the majority of children, that is going to be in the school, but increasingly, I guess, post-COVID and the other string of natural disasters, it's going to be other places that are safe, and that's got to be the starting point. Ultimately, hopefully, it's in the education system, but if that's not the case now, I think it has to be in other safe places, as Kate termed them.
Cool, cool. And if you can just hand your microphone to the man behind you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Caleb from YP Space. I'm very pale, very male, and hopefully not going to go stale. And my colleagues are encouraged to tell me as soon as I go stale, and I'm going to get out of their way. But my observation, I guess, is that this whole morning has led to exactly the same message that just keeps coming at us. It's about, I represent regional communities, and I think this is a really important difference. Someone mentioned the difference between Canterbury and Fairfield. We live in Port Macquarie on the mid-north coast, and Kempsey on the further up the mid-north coast, Biripi country and Dungutty country, beautiful parts of the country, and just slightly south of Michelle. I forgot what I was going to say. I just know what I need to say is that the differences are the same where we are. If you go to Port Macquarie and go to Wauchope, for example, those two communities are as uniquely different as perhaps the North Shore and southwestern Sydney are uniquely different. So, and also I hear Kathy this morning saying one voice, one pressure point. I think the pressure point actually is your community. The issues are huge. All the stuff we heard outlined this morning says to the government, you got no hope. I mean, I drove a couple of thousand kilometres over the weekend to get here because I choose to go driving. There's potholes on every kilometre of road. The government has no hope of solving all of the community's issues, but the community has the solutions. As Michelle says, we know our people, we know our communities. We'll find the person with the wheelchair because that'll be the first person our community goes to. Someone in Sydney or Canberra won't say, oh, here's the list. We won't ring that list anyway. We'll go straight to that person because that's how communities respond. And I think if there's a learning from the pandemic, we saw on Dungutty country, the first time, Dungutty country's large and beautiful, but not heavily populated. This is the town of Kempsey. The first time that we came out for a community event post-pandemic, I think my magnificent colleague Deb Toga beside me was part of the organising committee, and I think they predicted 300 people. 1,200 people turned up that day. The entire community came and said, we're all in this. And I think everywhere we turn, we see that community is just one group. And I know this is, again, I'm sorry to be a white guy that sits here and says these things, but community isn't just you or you. What Jean said, you nailed it. I mean, I could just talk all day, but Jean, you said Aboriginal-led responses, I think, are absolutely it. The oldest culture on earth says it takes a community to raise a child. We see in regional Australia communities raising their children, raising houses to put them in, raising responses that are community appropriate, different here than they are there than they are there. What needs to happen really is that the power needs to go to those communities in the first place. We need to be able to go to government and say, we've got the whole solution. Just give us that infrastructure that you talk about, along with funding so we can service deliver. We can give everyone in this room 3 laptops. Anyone need a laptop? We've got so much bloody IT funding. You can't sleep under a laptop in the rain. We're a youth homelessness service. It doesn't work.
I think that's a really important point. I think that we're in a unique position where people understand the value of community more than they ever did. You look at Facebook community groups, you know, they're huge now. People know their neighbours now they didn't before COVID. So you actually have more power now to use than you ever have. So it really is that time. I think we have another question at the back, and then we're just going to go to Angela for a very quick wrap up before lunch.
Hi, my name's Matthew. I'm a Palawa man from Oyster Bay, Tasmania. My wife was Bundjalung, so nice to see you here. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land. And I just want to go further on from my brother over there who was talking. When we're asking the question vision, voice and value, we have to ask whose vision, whose voice and whose value. Okay, is it a collective vision, a collective voice, a collective, or an individual one? Because what I see here today is a great representation of a lot of services. I see somebody representing, and I am so jealous of those shoes. Okay, disabilities from youth, from D. We spoke. We had to talk about DV during COVID. We talked about youth and mental health. We talked about the rise in the rate of young women between 17. I think was it 17 and 24. We didn't talk about young men between 15 and 24, who went up 51%. I'm also blatantly aware of what we're missing here today, and it might be on tomorrow, I don't know. But where's somebody representing our seniors and their issues in the community? Fairfield has a huge seniors numbers. Where's somebody representing men here? Men's health in this country is absolutely appalling, but we don't talk about it. Fairfield had the nation's highest rates of men's deaths, avoidable men's deaths. But we don't have any representation. So again, I'm hearing, I think what my colleague over there talked about was we're hearing a lot of the same when we come to these conferences, a lot of the same speeches. Okay? Then when we take that, and from our first keynote speakers, we talked about the acupuncture points and local communities. Local communities should always stand up and talk out. But when does your vision, your voice, or your value around housing, around disability, around youth and mental health, around domestic violence, then whose takes priority? So then do we get into a jumble again about who has the right to have priority? So I'm asking whose vision, whose voice, and whose value?
Well, hopefully over the next day or two, all those different voices will be heard, and I don't think it's a question of who's got priority. They actually all do. They all need to be heard. I'm going to get Angela to finish up briefly before lunch.
Oh, look, thanks Dee, and thanks to everyone on the panel. Once again, I think we've all learnt a significant amount. I think one of the things I tried to highlight in the depressing sort of, as we say, we're dismal science, although it doesn't quite mean that, but let's just use the term, report findings, was that there were these stories of local solutions and the importance of empowering local communities to provide those, to lead those solutions. One thing I will say, and I think it's important for the sector more broadly, and it's not necessarily mainstream, that doesn't mean stepping back. So I think in the past what we've thought is that that meant, okay, it's Aboriginal led, but we have no role in support. Aboriginal led means partnering with humility, allowing another person to lead, but being there to support, whether that's with funding or expertise or resources. It doesn't mean it's not our space and we have no responsibility. So I think often that's where local solutions fall down. But it's about how we approach those relationships and the humility with which that approach takes. And I think we've seen that a number of examples, and Aboriginal controlled organisations will get held up because they are the exemplars at the moment in this space, and they need to be held up as the exemplars in this space in Australia. The Aboriginal controlled sector is doing an amazing job, particularly in the health sector, to deliver local solutions in partnership, but Aboriginal led. And so let's look to that sector in particular, hopefully over the next day and a half, to see what we can learn about how those services can be integrated together and how you do have locally led, community led service delivery.
Thank you. Right, now lunch is being served downstairs. We are back at 1:45. Please be on time because we've got a fantastic presentation happening then. So see you at 1:45.